So just in terms of the overview of what we're going to be doing. So we're talking about the political responsibility of the church. At times, we as preachers and teachers get critiqued for with the impression that somehow the church should not be involved in politics. It probably is pretty clear that we don't have a view that we're going to just separate church and state, but what is the relationship then of the church and state, the church and politics is really what we want to take a look at and try to understand the roles of that. Obviously, we're in a very critical time now with the election looming, that we're right in the heading into the home stretch here on the election, and so we want to, I think it's very timely to focus on these issues. So just in terms of the overview, today we're talking about the public voice of the church and an introduction to that. Then next week it'll be when the church must resist. So when must resist. The third one will be on telling the truth in political campaigns. The fourth one, on October the 4th, we'll look at the responsibility of future generations. And then on October the 11th, the final one, it's election 2020, what is at stake? My hope is, and we'll see what the numbers are, we'll have to see what might actually work. But I'm hoping that October the 11th, the final one, may be a little bit more like a table talk when we do that. It could be a little complicated because of the number of people we have. But my thought is I'd love to get people sharing what they think is at stake as we head into this election. And it'll become clear as I present, one of our responsibilities in our evangelical Lutheran tradition is to be actively engaged in society and as citizens. And obviously voting is, in our context, voting is an important part of citizenship. And so and that means being well prepared to vote is also part of our responsibility as citizens, just to give a little taste of where we're heading. I do want to read the course description. It says this course offered during the final stages of the 2020 presidential election process will focus on the political responsibility of the church in ordinary and extraordinary times. And I would say we have a lot of extraordinary things going on, at least in the time we're in, and yet voting has been an ordinary thing that we've been doing for literally the whole history of our nation. One can make a strong case that we are in an extraordinary time due to the global coronavirus pandemic, nationwide protests against racial injustice, 4 years of often corrupt and unjust rule by President Trump and his administration, and the looming threat of catastrophic climate change, which has been lifted up as one of the key factors in some of the wildfires we're dealing with here in Oregon and the West. We can also make a case then that a crucial way to respond to our current situation this fall, though, is to engage in the most basic political act available to U.S. citizens, voting in the upcoming election. In exploring our theme, we'll utilize insights from the life and writings of German Lutheran pastor and professor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and consider how they apply to our political context today. And then, many of you know, Bonhoeffer was hung by the Nazis in 1945 for his role in the conspiracy to assassinate Adolf Hitler, which was clearly an extraordinary action that he was involved in. And then we'll also draw on observations from contemporary theologians, political commentators, as well as all of us. All right. So let's head on into the first one in the introduction and have a chance to talk about the public voice of the church. So the priming the pump question, I was here, and we're not going to break into small groups, but you can imagine if we were in the fellowship hall, for those of you who've been part of classes there, this would be the question I'd have you start out with to think about for a few minutes and discuss with one another. Does the church have a political responsibility? And if the answer is yes, what is it? And if you really think no, and there are people that question even that, the idea that the church has political responsibility, then the challenge is to explain why it does not. You'll pick up from me what I'm saying is even a decision not to be involved in politics is a political decision, because politics is always about decision making. That's what it is. Politics is decision-making of the community, society, congregation we're a part of. So the idea that you can avoid decision-making in any of those contexts, in the way I'm presenting it, doesn't even make sense. But if somebody says no to politics, what's the basis of that would be the question I would lift up. And it'd be important to be able to articulate how that's distinctive from what I'll be presenting. So I want to start out with a critique of two spheres thinking, as it has been called. So there has been a tendency in the Christian tradition to think in two spheres. And one we might call the divine, holy, supernatural Christian sphere. And then there's the worldly, the profane, the natural, and the unchristian sphere. And it's like they're two different spheres. And so we've had this tendency to think in those terms. So if some examples of this in the medieval realm, the realm of nature was viewed as subordinate to the realm of grace. Okay, so you think that way. There was what's often called a pseudo-Lutheran point of view, where the world orders were viewed as autonomous and often in opposition to the law of Christ. So the law of Christ is the law of love, but the worldly orders are going to function according to other principles. It's just not practical or realistic to think that worldly orders are going to function according to the law of love. That's just being naive to think that. There's also a group that were often called the enthusiasts, who viewed the congregation of the elect, the followers of Jesus, doing battle against a hostile world, okay, in an effort to establish God's kingdom on earth. So with zeal and passion, and that was the so-called Peasants' War during the Reformation time in the mid-1520s. This is where Thomas Müntzer rallied all these followers of Jesus to go and do battle against all the evil out there and try to establish the kingdom of God on earth. And then there's a modern version of what we might call the pseudo-Lutheran view, is just the independence of the secular from the spiritual. So there's spiritual matters and there's secular matters. And you'd see variations on this in a variety of forms in our own context. So that one may seem somewhat familiar. During the Reformation, there was an emphasis on what's often been called the two kingdoms. So you had the church, the spiritual kingdom, and the world would be like the secular or temporal kingdom. The sword of the church would be the preached word, okay? And the sword of the world would be a sword or weapons or force, that force in order to establish what needs to happen. And then you talk about, in terms of leadership, there would be spiritual leaders for the church, or the spiritual office as it was called. And then you have secular government. Okay, so secular government runs the world. They use force as needed to keep order, keep law and order. And then you have the church functioning by the word, so on. And the idea then was, in the church, you don't use violence to try to force people to believe. That's just not going to work. But it may be necessary to use coercive or even violent force in the worldly order in order to maintain law and order. And so, just thinking ahead, you had somebody like even Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who at one time was really viewed himself as a pacifist, ends up getting involved in an attempt to assassinate the head of state, and felt he reached a point where he felt that was necessary to do. Can you justify that? He wasn't sure himself if he could justify what he was doing, even though he did engage in that act. Now here's the challenge, is how do we view what we might call spiritual leadership and political leadership, church in the world, but think of the role of the church and the role of the worldly orders or government and so on. How do we view them as distinct, that they're distinctive roles, distinctive tasks, without completely separating them? Because, and as people of faith, we believe that the whole earth is subject to the lordship of Christ, so we're all serving the same Lord. in a sense. That's, if Jesus is Lord, then we're all serving the same Lord. It's one God that we believe in. So how do we hold these two these roles and tasks together? And we recognize that both have the same sphere of action, as I call it here. We're talking about humanity. We're talking about the earth. Spiritual leaders and political leaders are both focused on that same sphere of action. And so that's the task then, is to understand the different tasks and responsibilities. Then if you go on, so what might we identify as the primary responsibility of the government? Obviously, we could say a lot about this, but let me give you a basic summary of what that responsibility might be. One thing government's expected to do is protect the basic rights of the people. And they tend to do that in two ways, at least in our context: by making laws and by enforcing the law. Okay, so both things are important. It's to protect basic rights of people. Obviously, we run into trouble when some people's rights are ignored or neglected. And so then you get something like what we've been going through in terms of racial injustice. But it is the responsibility of government to protect the rights of people by making laws and enforcing those. Somebody speaking up? All right, a second part is to provide for the well-being of the people, give them opportunities to thrive, provide goods and services. And one of the tasks that we expect of government, at least many do, is to provide some kind of safety net. So when you have a pandemic or some kind of crisis, there is a safety net for people. And we want government to be able to provide that. And then the third one would be to invest in the abilities of the people. And so you think of education is investing in the abilities of people, and then various resources also are part of the investment, making resources available for people. So that's one way of understanding some of the primary responsibilities of government. What then is the primary responsibility of the church? So here's one way of viewing that, and you could get a lot of different accounts on what the primary responsibility of the church is, but I'll lift this one up for you. The primary responsibility of the church is to proclaim the reconciliation of God and the world in Jesus Christ, to proclaim the gospel. God and the world have been reconciled in Jesus, and no matter what else we do, that's something that is specific task that the church is called to. And that proclamation is done not by the sword. In other words, you cannot, this was an important Reformation principle, you cannot coerce somebody into believing. And it's been tried, but that's not how faith works. That's not how, you don't coerce somebody into trusting you. If you think of our relationships, if somebody tried to, I'm going to force you to trust me, it's just not the way it works, all right? So we use the word, we talk about using the word, that good news, gospel, and not the sword in order to carry out the task of proclamation. As evangelical Lutherans, evangelical comes from the Greek word evangel, which means gospel. So we are gospel-centered people, and that is grounded in Scripture. So that's the written account of the gospel. And we believe if we're going to talk about the reconciliation of God and the world, how can you not pay attention to what's going on in the world? I mean, it's just basic. You have to pay attention to what's going on in the world. We can't ignore. It would be, I would be derelict in my duty as a pastor not to pay attention to what's going on in our context right now. Pandemic, wildfires, political deep divides that are, and these things are serious. People are dying over these kinds of things. Racial injustice. We cannot ignore these. From this perspective, there's no way to ignore that. It would be to turn our backs on the world. We turn our backs on the world. Now, how we're engaged with that, that's what we still need to clarify. And what our particular role as people of faith is, what our role is as citizens, and so on, and what are the different roles of leaders. Another primary responsibility of the church is to warn human beings of sin. And so if a particular group of people is being neglected because of who they are, that is sin from our Judeo-Christian point of view, because every person's created the image of God. That means we are compelled to speak out on that and name the sin. It doesn't mean by naming the sin, that we've become experts even on how to resolve the situation or make it better. That's not the point. But the sin is clear at that point, and we need to name that and not be afraid to name that. Another part of our responsibility is to guide the followers of Jesus in living out their faith in the world. And that we do, obviously, pastoral leaders have that responsibility, but that we help each other with, both by example, talking with one another. We read books that help us with that, obviously study scripture and so on. All that is part of guiding followers of Jesus in living out our faith in the world. And then another one is just to comfort people in their affliction. And some people, like, you may have heard with John and Christine Core losing their home on the Mackenzie River. Right now, the most immediate thing I suspect they needed is just comfort from people that know them. It's not like there's even an immediate need. They have family to stay with, but the immediate need is to be comforted in our afflictions. When we do that for people who are ill or sick. So comforting people is a responsibility of the church and the people of God. Now, in terms of, then I want to talk about the ecclesial responsibility of government. Part of that job is to provide a well-ordered, just society in which the church is able to do its work. So if everything's chaotic, obviously the church and a lot of things are not going to function well in a chaotic situation. And so that's part of the ecclesial responsibility, or the church, the responsibility of government for the church, and that would apply also to other communities of faith, and the church is a community of faith. In our context, government is called to support the practice of faith without enforcing one particular faith. So that's very important in our context. Freedom of religion is an important principle in our society. So the state or government ought not become the founder of a new religion or faith community, and it's not responsible for the proclamation or confession of faith in Jesus. It's just not the government's job. And so the sword, we don't want government enforcing our proclamation. That's not what we want them to do. We want them to allow us to be able to carry it out. That's the role of government, is to make sure we can carry out that task. But we don't want them using the sword to try to force people to believe in a certain way. That's not its job. In terms of the political responsibility of the church, it is to fulfill the primary responsibility of the proclamation, the reconciliation of God and the world in Jesus Christ. They say the church must attend, and I've been saying this already, to the realities of the world and the institutions influencing those realities. Now, in ordinary times, we need to discern the relationship of our proclamation to the government, economy, and so on, through direct, respectful speech, make the government aware of its failures to fulfill its office. So if the government's not doing its job, we need to say something. If you're not taking care of this group of people, and people are going hungry or whatever it is, or being persecuted, you're not getting your job done. We need to name that. We call the government the sin and injustice by name. Followers of Jesus in public office or work have a special responsibility to discern God's intentions for their particular institutions. So if we have somebody like Jeff Merkley, who's a member of Central Lutheran Church, and he's one of our senators, he's trying to figure out how to live out his faith as a senator. And so that puts him in a very challenging but important position. We look to him for leadership and how to function in a context like that. The goal is not to establish a Christian government, a Christian economy, and so on, but to participate in the formation. We want responsible government, responsible economy, and so on. And so that's what we're hoping for. We want the government to do its job, basically. So in the current context in the United States, just to say what are some specific consequences or implications of what I'm presenting, any attempt to make an idol of the nation must be challenged. So language like "Make America Great Again" just reeks of trying to make an idol out of the nation. Now, there may be a way to look at that. There's time where we take care of our own families, and yes, we need to take care of, we can love our nation and all of that, but it's so easy to make an idol out of the nation. So that's the caution here. We need to expose attempts to scapegoat groups of people, whether it's immigrants, protesters, Muslims, Portland. I mean, literally, the Portland's being lifted up as an example of almost like a scapegoat. In a strange way, Portland's being used as a scapegoat. Now, I don't know what's going to happen now. People are probably looking at us in horror, thinking all of Portland's on fire. And now when much of Western Oregon is actually on fire, now they might have sympathy for us. So we'll see what happens with that. We need to engage in efforts to pursue racial justice. So, it's in Micah, love kindness, pursue justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Micah 6:8. Pursuit of justice and treating people right, treating people as created in the image of God. That's just basic to who we are. And then government has every right to insist on churches not gathering in large groups to protect the well-being of people. So if churches don't get this right, the government may need to step in to protect people from the church. We've had examples of that around the country where churches have simply ignored the well-being of their people, brought them together, and had major outbreaks of COVID-19. So that there are times when the government needs to call the church to account. And if it's not government, one of the reasons we had a terrible problem with in the Catholic Church, but it was also going on in our Protestant churches with clergy sexual abuse and harassment. And finally, the insurance companies had to get the Episcopal Church and our Evangelical Lutheran Church on board and saying, you're going to do boundary training for your clergy or we're not insuring you. So it can come back at the church when we also do not engage, when we're not doing what we need to do, or we're violating basic treatment of people and not doing anything about it, then the government may need to step in that way with us. Some final comments then. The separation of church and state in the United States is a misnomer. I'll just say we talk about it. I understand why people bring it up and what some of the concerns are there, but it's simply not accurate. For example, the church gets significant tax breaks from the government. How is it separation of church and state if we're getting major property tax breaks from the government? There's a reason the government's doing that. They also provide some of those to other nonprofits, and they think that the good provided by those nonprofits and the communities of faith overall is worth supporting. And so we get tax breaks, but that's not separation of church and state. That's just defining the relationship in a certain way. Churches are responsible to name sin and injustice when the state engages in it, and that's not separation of church and state. That's called doing our job to name sin in the world when we see it. So what we really are talking about in terms of the relationship of church and state or church and government is the church and state being what we might call in healthy tension. Respecting each other's roles, but also calling each other to account if need be. And so it's working, and that is an ongoing process working out the relationship of church and state. So church and government, again, to repeat, have distinctive tasks with the same field of action. Humanity, the world, and I think it's what we've become aware of and more in the last number of years is we have to be aware of the ecological context in which all this is carried out also. And to ignore that is simply to blind ourselves to the reality of what's going on. I can tell you, our governor just came out and said climate change is part of this. the California governor is just like, you got to be, almost, he didn't say it quite like this, but he said, you got to be kidding if you don't think climate change is turning our whole state in here into just a tinderbox. In any case, we are connected. What we are learning more and more and more is how interconnected we are with the whole Earth community, other creatures, other human beings. And if we don't recognize those interconnections, it is going to be increasingly difficult for us to work together so that we can actually have a healthy Earth home to live on, and for people and other creatures to be able to thrive. Last comment I'll make, the silence of the church in the face of state injustice is sin. And so if we are silent, that is sin, and it has consequences, and people die when we don't speak up. And I'm not just casting stones in here. There are times I've done this for 34, 35 years now, and there are times when I wish I had spoken up more strongly than I did. And so a lot of time you can't go back and fix that either. But to be silent in the face of sin is simply, it is sin to be silent in the face of injustice and so on. All right, nobody interrupted me while I was going. You could if you needed to, but any comments or questions that you want to lift up here to follow up on what I've just said? And Janet, and then Cindy.
I'm interested in the way you use the word sin, because sin, of course, there's nuances in the use of the word sin. And when we say we have a sinful nature, we don't mean that we have a nature that inclines us to doing bad things. When we say humans have a sinful nature, we mean that we aren't going to reach the glory of God. We aren't ever going to be perfect. And when we say we've committed a sin, we mean we've done something that is wrong. So a sinful nature and having committed a sin are two different uses of the word sin. And it confuses, when we teach our little children about sin, it's easier to teach them the concrete meaning of the word sin. You know, a sin is a thing you do that's wrong. But then they get confused because that doesn't really help them with a sinful nature. That sounds like we have a nature that makes us want to do things that are bad. But that's not what God is saying, that we have a nature that makes us want to do things that are bad. It's worse than that. It's that we just will never reach the glory of God because people are not that way. So I'm interested in you saying that if we see something like you said, the church should warn humans of sin, such as the neglect of a whole group of people. That's certainly wrongdoing when we see a whole group of people being neglected, and it's an outcome of the sinful nature of human beings. But I don't know that I would call that a sin itself.
Yeah, you could call it behavior that leads to broken relationships and causes people to be broken down. So what you're asking is more to fill out what we're talking about, but I'm really talking about stuff like what constitutes injustice. And so I would name it, and injustice is one aspect. And there's various aspects of it, and you point out very well, Janet, if we want to talk about sin, you got to nuance it to say more.
Yeah.
There's a lot of confusion over it. Cindy, go ahead, Cynthia. Unmute yourself there,
right.
I guess.
Yeah, so I was just under the primary responsibilities of government, I would just break out that resource piece under the third and perhaps add a fourth, that goes to, that speaks to care and stewardship of natural resources.
Oh, yeah, that's good. I like that. Yeah, that's good addition, Cynthia. I'm seeing, let's see, Luann? Yeah, go ahead, Luann, and then I'm going to go down to Carol Horton after that.
I would also include healthcare under that.
Mm.
Provide for the well-being of people. And I mean, providing for the well-being of people also implies healthcare, but I think we
Right.
have to be specific about that.
Yeah, no argument there. Carol Horton.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Okay. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the idea of attempting to make an idol of our nation, such as Make America Great Again. Because I have a number of very conservative religious friends who are really big Trump supporters. How can I talk to them about this? Can you be a little more specific about how you see that making an idol of America?
Well, it could be a challenge talking there, because it's so I don't want to set you up and for something that may not. Sometimes we do have to make decisions. When I said silence is a sin, there may be times where actually silence is what we need to do, because if we speak, it will actually, because of the context and what's going on, if our words are going to create more damage or destructiveness or whatever, so we have to make some decisions like that along the way. So I want to, it's a good way to caution what I said, even though silence is a sin when we just ignore something. So an idol, if you think of the first commandments, you shall have no other gods before me, is, the basic. And Martin Luther, just go back to the catechism there, he said that's, whatever your heart clings to, whatever is most important to you in life, that is your God. And so if we, and this may be hard to determine in some cases, but we can make an idol out of literally anything. And if we put something ahead of God, and some of the language that I heard from Make America Great Again, taken more to its extreme, or that's where you're making an idol out of the nation. So where it gets tough then is, does that actually impact the way we treat immigrants, for example? Because from a standpoint of faith, for the Judeo-Christian tradition, I mean, it says in Leviticus 19:33 and 34, you shall treat the resident, I'll call it resident non-citizen among you. It says resident alien, but we're talking about resident non-citizens. You shall treat the resident non-citizen among you as yourself. Right before that, Leviticus 19, it says you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But that's instructing, that was in Leviticus even, instructing people to treat the stranger among you as yourself. So if making America great again means that we can start, that leads to us to behavior where we're treating people as demeaning them or not caring about them or something, that becomes an issue for our faith. We can make an idol out of the flag even. The Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, whatever you think about the Jehovah's Witnesses, but I can tell you they take that first commandment very, very seriously, and it's why they don't want their children pledging allegiance to the flag. They're not evil people. In fact, they try to follow the teachings of Jesus as much as the rest of us, but they really are concerned with making an idol out of the flag. You can make an idol out of making money. I mean, if your top priority in life is making a lot of money or having a good life or having the most beautiful home in the neighborhood, you've made an idol out of that too. So that's the context in which I'm sharing that. Now, on the other hand, again, there's nothing wrong with, you take care of your home, you take care of your family, you're concerned about your fellow Americans, you're proud to be an American. When I've gone overseas in the past, I always enjoy coming home because it's what we know and love. So how do we balance that, a love of nation that's fitting without making an idol out of it? That's a little more what I'm trying to say on that. Other questions or comments that you want to lift up? I don't know if I'm missing anybody on the next page here. Let me just check. Anybody else? Comment or question? Concern, even a concern that you're lifting up. Janet, go ahead. Oh, and then Lynn. Go Janet and then Lynn.
I want to say that you're very gracious about taking comments. You know, you're really able to. I really admire how you don't get defensive or unhappy when people bring things up, and you're able to answer. And I think it's really awesome how you're able to lead this discussion and just be really straightforward. I'm enjoying this a lot.
Well, thank you, Janet. Appreciate it. I hope you're on to me so that's how I am operating. Thank you. Lynn, go ahead. You need to unmute.
Not unmute.
There you are. Oh, no, almost. I can only ask you to unmute, it says here, so I can't do it for you.
All right, can you hear me now?
Gotcha. Yeah. Oh,
all right, I'll just have to hold these down while I talk.
Okay.
So I was curious, when the political responsibility of the church sees injustice or attempts to make an idol out of the state or things like that, and therefore comes in direct conflict with the state, what do you think about the benefits that the churches in America get from the state, such as being taxed, not being taxed and things like that? Yeah. If we're speaking out against the state, do we retain those benefits?
Let me just use another example to show that there's a danger that we're going to lose our nerve because of that, because we're worried about our own well-being and existence. The fact is, pastors know that if people don't put money in the offering plate, they're not going to get paid their salaries. I'd love to be able to say that's never compromised anything I've ever done as a pastor, but I think that'd be a bit naive. And so it's really takes a pretty healthy church community for a pastor to be able to speak plainly to the community and have the community not hold it against the pastor, but just deal with the issues. But so I think there's potential for churches to be compromised because of the tax breaks we get and be unwilling to speak out. But I think, in a sense, that's the cost in tough times, and especially in with more extraordinary times, and we're certainly dealing with some extraordinary things right now. Although we still can vote, so we don't want to just assume that all is lost here. We need to vote. In times like this, we just have to do what we're called to do and let the chips fall where they may. But the political leaders may not be happy with us. And so in Nazi Germany, Hitler and the Nazis basically began removing certain privileges for the confessing churches, the churches that resisted the Nazis. And they actually started removing privileges. It's one of the reasons even educating pastors became a real challenge because of the way the Nazis dealt with that. They weren't happy with some of the positions being taken by the confessing church. So there is a cost to that. And, it's a bit like, if we're going to bite the hand that's feeding us in one sense, we probably should expect there might be some consequences to that. And there are churches, small church communities, who I think it'd be better if we did not get those kind of tax breaks, and just so that we could, it wouldn't compromise us. Ordinary times, usually not as much of an issue, but it certainly can be when it comes time to speak out on a particular issue in a very challenging time. Outlines, if you didn't have the outline, they're available. Homepage of the website, down in the right-hand corner, you'll see where you can click and get the outlines. And the outline for next week will be there probably by midweek, and you can click and get the the next one for next week. And we're going to talk about when the church must resist. So Lynn's question was a good lead into that. So when must the church resist? And then what are the consequences of that? So Lynn and I did not work that question out ahead of time, but it turned out to be just a very helpful question leading to next week. All right, thanks everybody. And we can do some informal conversation also after the 11 o'clock worship. So take care. Blessings.